Christmas Eve, 1945, Fayette County, West Virginia. Snow on the ground, a string of lights in the window, and the Sodder family house glowing warm by the roadside near the little town of Fayetteville. George and Jenny Sodder were first-generation Italian-Americans who ran a trucking business. They'd raised 10 children in that big frame home. On December 24, 5 of those kids, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, were allowed to stay up late to play with toys around the tree. Their older siblings and parents drifted off to bed one by one. It felt safe. It felt ordinary. Just after midnight, the phone rang. Jenny answered. A woman's voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know, laughed strangely, and clinked glasses in the background, like a party on the line. Jenny told her she had the wrong number and hung up. As she padded back through the dark, she noticed the living room's lights still on and the front door unlocked. Odd, but not alarming. She turned off the lights, latched the door, and went to bed. Minutes later, Jenny woke to a dull thud on the roof, then a rolling sound. Silence returned. At about 1:30 a.m., smoke began to snake under the bedroom door. Fire. She shouted for George and the older kids, who escaped down the stairs through heat and cinders. But the 5 younger children who had fallen asleep in the upstairs bedrooms did not follow. In the chaos, George and the older boys tried to reach them, first up the stairs, which were already a torch, then outside, where the plan was simple: raise a ladder to the second-floor window, smash it in, and bring them out. Only the family's ladder, normally kept leaning against the side of the house, was gone. George raced for his work trucks, intending to back them against the house to climb up. Neither would start, though both had been running perfectly that week. A neighbor sprinted to call the fire department, but phones were acting strange, one operator couldn't be reached, and another call attempt failed. A motorist finally drove into town to raise the volunteer chief. By the time the fire crew assembled and made it up the hill, the Sodder house was cinders. The entire structure had collapsed in about 45 minutes. At dawn, the chief and townspeople sifted the ash. In a typical fatal fire, investigators expect to find recognizable bone fragments, especially from children, whose remains, grim as it is, do not fully calcine in most house fires. But nothing turned up that morning, no bodies, no shards, only some household debris and a vague explanation to the family that the blaze had burned too hot. The official finding, written up later, was that faulty wiring caused the fire and the 5 children perished. The coroner's jury signed off. The case, on paper, was closed. But the facts would not sit still. First, the phone line. A repairman later said it hadn't burned, it had been cut. Someone had climbed the pole and sliced it about 14 feet above the ground. Second, the missing ladder turned up days later, strangely tossed down a roadside embankment. Third, those trucks that refused to start. A mechanic told George later it looked like they'd been tampered with. And fourth, the ringing threats George had received in the months before the fire, frequently about his outspoken criticism of Mussolini, suddenly felt darker. One visitor's warning to George stuck in Jenny's mind: your house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. Jenny couldn't accept that 5 bodies could leave no trace. She began testing that fear against reality. She contacted a crematorium and learned that even after hours at extremely high temperatures, bone fragments remain. She gathered animal bones and burned them in open fires herself. She still found pieces afterward. When she pressed the point with local officials, she got a compromise. The chief quietly returned to the site and handed the family a bag containing what he said were human organs recovered from the ash, proof, perhaps, that the children had died. A pathologist in town examined the contents. It wasn't organs at all, it was beef liver. Untouched by flame. The rumor in town was that someone had found it in a box and added it to the ashes to placate the family. Within weeks, tips started coming in. A woman working at a roadside tourist stop swore she'd served breakfast to a group of 5 children the morning after the blaze, accompanied by 2 men who were Italian-looking. A hotel clerk in Charleston said the same. 5 kids checked in with 2 adults and wouldn't let anyone speak to them. A bus driver said he saw fireballs in the night sky as he drove past the Sodder place. None of it was enough to force a new inquiry. All of it gnawed at the family. Jenny wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, begging for help. Hoover wrote back that he sympathized, but unless the local authorities invited federal jurisdiction, his hands were tied. The sheriff declined. A private detective surfaced, took the case, and then disappeared, leaving only a bill. The Sodders hired lawyers, they petitioned the governor, they even excavated the ashes themselves. In that dig, they found vertebrae fragments, finally, something tangible. The Smithsonian Institution examined the bones and determined they belonged to a single individual aged 16 to 22, older than any of the missing 5. Maurice, the eldest, was 14. Worse, the bones showed no sign of exposure to fire. The most likely explanation, they'd been mixed into the soil by previous fill or during the chaotic search. Not the children. Not a solution. Just another circle. In 1952, George built a billboard on Route 16 with the children's photos, the fire date, and a standing reward for information. If the county wouldn't look, the road would. Over the years, the sign became a landmark, an accusation on legs, reviving speculation that the kids had been kidnapped, perhaps by someone connected to wartime politics. Or to the black market adoption pipeline. Jenny began wearing black every day. George combed tips, sometimes driving across state lines on a rumor. One letter arrived in 1967 with a photo of a young man in his 20s. On the back, a message, Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Illo boys A90132, or 90,135. The face looked like Louis, the numbers looked like a code. The family hired another private investigator to track down the source. He took the retainer and vanished like the first one. The trail ran cold again. Over the decades, explanations hardened into camps. The official line, electrical fire, children perished, never accounted for the cut telephone line, the gone and found ladder, the stubborn trucks, or the absence of burned bone. The natural line, house fires can destroy remains, clashed with the Smithsonian analysis and with what cremation furnaces routinely show. The criminal line, kidnapping under cover of arson, had motive problems but explained why no remains were there to find. The militia, mafia, politics line, punishment for George's anti-Mussolini stance, fit the threats he'd received, but offered no smoking gun. Every version solved some pieces and broke others. What remains are scenes. The pole, cut. The phone operator's failure. A neighbor watching the house at odd hours from a parked car days before the fire. The thud on the roof and that rolling sound, a neighbor boy later confessed to tossing pineapple bombs, small explosive devices, around Christmastime. He never admitted to hitting the Sodder roof. A coroner's jury impaneled so quickly it included, the family later said, a local life insurance salesman who had threatened George when he refused to buy a policy. Your house will go up in smoke. It had. A mother in black, years later, turning down the radio at 3 a.m., still listening for a truck door, a footstep, a knock. George died in 1969, still searching. Jenny died in 1989, still hoping. The billboard came down not long after. Their surviving children, older now than their parents were that winter, kept the case open in their hearts. And the modern re-examination by the Smithsonian of those vertebrae added one last sober line to the ledger: the bones recovered at the site were not from the Sodder children. Which means, after all of it, we are still exactly where the family was at that first gray dawn, staring at the ash of a winter house and asking how 5 children vanished without a trace. Was it an electrical fire with tragic, rare destruction? A staged blaze to hide an abduction? A local grudge carried out under cover of night? If there's an answer, it's buried in a country back road, a burned foundation, a misfiled report. Some mysteries fade. This one keeps its own vigil, like those photos on the billboard once did, watching the traffic, waiting for the right pair of eyes.